The Salty Sales Sages.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2. Because Simon here has managed more salespeople than I have, we're going to defer to Simon's knowledge today because it's really superior to mine. So let's kick off quickly, Simon, with this topic because we want to get through quite a lot. How do you go about setting your budget and arguing your budget for salespeople?
This is actually a real bugbear of mine, because very often what happens in businesses is the sales or the revenue projections come down from the CEO or the board, and they're just sort of dictated. So it's sort of a top-down approach. And actually, that's a real challenge because sometimes they bear no relation to what's actually achievable. I really have an issue with goals being stretchy but achievable to be motivational. So the first thing is, top-down is never a good idea, but if you do get a top-down budget, you need to build a bottom-up approach and then try and negotiate it. And what I mean by that is building it from the individual salespeople up. So looking at your territories, looking at what you did last year, looking at where you can improve, looking at how many people you've got, and so on and so forth, right? You build it from the bottom up, and then you end up with a hybrid approach between the top down and the bottom up, if that makes sense.
So if you're hired into a position, how do you argue those points with your senior management?
I think I mentioned in the first podcast at the end of it, a business that I joined where the quota was set for $10 million, and they'd done whatever, 2.5 years the year before. So you don't really know when you come in how realistic this stuff is. You don't really know how good the individual salespeople are. So I think you need a little bit of time to sort of get to know them and to get to figure that out. I mean, you can certainly look back at what they achieved last year, do all the things I was talking about, ask questions, try and figure out what has actually changed. And then I think when it comes to hiring and firing salespeople, well, again, you need to figure out what you're working with in terms of the team. And that'll become, in the first quarter or two, that'll become pretty clear. So I always take the approach of going in and evaluating first and being careful about it and figuring out, okay, who do I want to keep and why? What do I need to offer the team in terms of additional training, coaching, mentoring, etc.? Where should I move them to? If there are any really obvious problems up front, well, then I'll make the changes. I've either grown up in businesses and got to a board level, or I've come in at the board level. So I have that advantage in that I'm talking with the other executives, and they brought me in because they respect my ability. I think it's harder if you come in as a sort of mid-level manager.
Yeah.
Then you've really got to sort of build up a bit of respect and internally before you start making the moves.
So putting your board hat on and looking at it from a senior management perspective, what sort of points do the senior management want to see to give them confidence to say, if we give this person more money to hire another person or do something different, that it's going to actually result in an uplift in sales?
Well, I think to back it up just for a second, I would say that if you come in at a mid-level and the budget is set, even if you come in at a senior level and the budget is set, there is a good chance that the budget isn't going to change, right? Yeah. So you might well be able to move people around within that budget, hire and fire, or should I say fire and then hire. But I think when you come in at that level, you're going to need to demonstrate very clearly why you want to make these changes and what you believe the result of those changes will be. And you're going to get grilled if you're mid-level management, right, on why you want to make the changes. So I think, honestly, up front, the budgets are likely set. The one thing I would say is, if you've got a budget, then you can do a couple of things. You can just negotiate on the fly, which is what a lot of people will try and do. Or you can try and work with something like a revenue achievement gate. So you can say, okay, if we achieve a certain level of revenue within X amount of time, and we can demonstrate that we're showing growth in pipeline, opportunities moving through faster, then I have the option of hiring one or more new salespeople at this level for these territories or products, etc., at this point in time. That's how I would approach it, right? So I'm giving them something, I'm demonstrating that I know what I'm doing, and once I achieve that, they'll give me the grace of a bit of unbudgeted cash that allows me to do what I want to do. But can I make one final important point here?
Yes.
When we're talking about hiring salespeople, I have a quite a firm rule, which is don't hire any salespeople unless your existing team is actually working well. Okay, I hear this and I see this all the time. The idea is, simply we'll just hire a bunch more salespeople and our revenue will go up,
Yeah.
and that's just simply not the case. There are lots of things you can do within an existing team to make them more productive.
Yeah.
But the idea that you grow revenue simply by just adding 5 salespeople is nonsense. If the foundation is not there and you don't have a good team and they're not running properly and you don't have a sensible sales process that works, etc., and you don't have good management, then just adding a bunch of people is not going to add to your revenue, but it sure as hell is going to add to your cost.
So when you are hiring and you think of the ramp up time before that salesperson becomes visibly productive, whether you measure that in sales or whether you measure that in meetings that are heading towards sales, do you consider where you are in the budget cycle, that you've just been given a budget and it's not going to be changed for a year, or you're 1 month away from it being changed? Do you make your hiring decisions and hiring timings based on the budget cycle as well, or do you not let that affect you?
I think it doesn't always affect. I think sometimes it's cleaner that way, right? Because you can define going into next year, this is what I want to do. I want to add this number of salespeople. This is where I'm going to put them, and so on and so forth. But stuff happens, right? You get people who leave, and sometimes you'll get someone who you really feel you must hire for whatever reason. So it's better to be organized about it. But I think even when something happens mid-year, you need to be really careful about it. You need to think it through and make sure you have a plan, because you'll need to be very, very clear on how that individual is going to add revenue and how long they're going to take to actually add that revenue. As we all know, there is a ramp up time for every single salesperson, no matter their role.
If things are going gangbusters and you are selling mid-budget cycle, is there usually an opportunity to go to the senior management and say, we're growing, we need to exploit this opportunity, you've got to put my budget up now so I can hire people? Is that a common thing, or do you still have to wait to the end of the budget cycle before that really is considered?
I think it varies from company to company, right? If things are going gangbusters, you're always in better shape.
Sure.
Of course, there's downstream effects of doing really, really well. So if you're making a lot of sales and you're ahead of budget, that's fine, so long as the rest of the business can actually stay on top of the business that you're bringing in, right? They can implement it, they can get stuff up and running, they can get their clients trained and so on. So long as that is all okay, then I really think that most businesses, if they're in growth mode, they're going to look at it and say, yeah, we'll allow you to add new people.
Who's your adversary, as it were, in terms of questioning your budget? Is it the financial director or the CEO most of the time?
I will say always the CFO, always, right?
CFO.
I mean, that's their job. So even if you're at the board level, you're going to have the CFO questioning everything you do. I mean, whether the CEO and the COO, those guys, it'll depend a little bit on their personality. If they're more sales-led, then in my experience, they tend to be a bit more gung-ho. But the CFO's job is always to say, well, hang on a minute, why are we doing this? And by the way, everybody else around the table will say, well, hang on a minute, if we're doing really well, we need a new whatever marketing person.
So they want to spend your money for you.
Yeah, of course they do. So it's never as easy as just, oh, well, I'm making more money than my quota or my sales targets, therefore I get to spend that money.
So my next question is, the phone rings, somebody's relocated, fantastic hire opportunity comes along for you to get a salesperson you know has been a great performer for a competitor or you've worked with before and you're really confident in working with them, or a really good person leaves. What do you do under those circumstances mid budget cycle?
Obviously, it's easier if you know this person and you've worked with them in the past, right? Because you know what they are capable of. But if you don't know the person, but you know that they work for a competitor, you've met them at conferences, they've come highly recommended, yada, 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 then you better make sure that you need that salesperson first of all, and that you have thought it through and you have a plan, right? Because you don't have a budget, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on adding someone extra outside of the budget process. So you need to be crystal clear on where you're going to add that revenue, where you will deploy that person. And by the way, just because the salesperson has been brilliant at another company, your competitor or a larger company or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be perfect for your company, right?
No, sure.
There are cultural differences between businesses, and you've got to consider, will that bringing that person on, will that be additive or will it cause problems? Now, the second question was, one of your best salespeople leaves. Okay, for the first thing, you should have seen that coming, right?
Yeah.
If you don't see that coming, that is a very serious indication, in my view, that something is wrong. So let's assume it happens. Even if you knew it was coming, you need to do an exit interview with them to find out why they are leaving, a very open one, and take whatever they say to heart. You usually won't be able to save those people because anyone worth their salt will have already negotiated where they're going to, and they're not going to change their mind just because you start begging, right? It's too late.
Yes.
You should always leave the door open for them to return, so don't burn bridges.
Right.
It didn't work at a company that I was a sales director for, primarily because the culture from the CEO of the business was one of hire and fire. So the culture from the very top of the business down was a sort of fear culture, right? If you don't perform, you get fired.
Yeah.
So there's not much you can do about that. You will unfortunately burn a lot of bridges when you have to.
And you'll never get good people working in that environment because they don't need to.
It's awful. It's awful. That was for me the most miserable time.
Almost guarantees you're going to get desperados working there.
Exactly. So let's assume you don't have that problem. You leave the door open, ready for a return, and you make sure you address the issues that came out in the exit interview urgently to avoid any repeat and have other people leaving, right? And then, of course, you've got to sit down and go, okay, now I've got to figure out how am I going to fill that hole, okay? Businesses are unforgiving, right? There is a sales target. Let's assume it's realistic. You've lost a person. Well, okay, sales target doesn't need to change. Everything else in the budget is the same. So you've now got to figure out, how am I going to meet that sales target? Do I reorganize a team? Do I obviously recruit to replace? How long is that going to take? How am I going to pick up the slack? That's quite a challenging job, but it's what you're hired for.
So the final question then that occurs to me, because we're going to round it off at 20 minutes. If you have a startup or scale up that suddenly receives an injection of money from investors, say a VC firm, it's very common for the VC firm to say, come on, let's grow the sales team, grow sales. Then you've suddenly got this budget injection. Have you ever been in that situation or seen that situation? And would you have a word of caution to people to not spend that money too quickly?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a common problem. What you see, sadly, quite a lot is there's this big injection of cash. There is a drive then to hire a lot of salespeople, usually on the back of the fact that the founders have put together a sort of hockey stick of revenue expectation, which is why the money has come in the first place, right? So now the investors want to see a return on that. The problem is, unless you have a sales process well defined and you've got very good onboarding and people know what they're supposed to be doing and they're well managed, then what you see more often than not is a ramp up in terms of the number of salespeople. A lot of money gets spent, and then 6-8 months down the line, if the revenue isn't coming through because you haven't got a proper plan, you don't have proper sales processes, people aren't doing their job properly, they're not properly managed, all those people start getting fired. Yeah. You've just got to focus on managing the team properly and having a sales process that is proven in place and building the team from there. I personally, I don't like those sort of businesses. I'd much rather grow a little bit slower and add people a little bit slower and make sure that each individual that we add is actually succeeding. That's what I'd much rather do.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're going to be interviewing a very top recruitment consultant next episode called David Bolden about the recruitment process. He's worked both in the buyers of a technology side and been a sales manager, a very senior one, and now runs his own recruitment firm. So that should be an interesting interview for episode 3. Thanks very much.
Thank you.